Lara Brown is the Senior Research Fellow in Equality and Identity at Policy Exchange. Thank you for joining us, Lara. I don't know whether you agree with me. How did you read the Alice Sullivan's report, and were you surprised by its findings?
Thank you for having me. I do agree with you. I did read the report, but the findings are not surprising. So what Professor Sullivan has found is something the campaign has been warning about for years. In 2022, so 3 years ago, Policy Exchange wrote Transgenderism and Policy Capture in the Criminal Justice System. And we pointed out there that many aspects of the criminal justice system were asking people for their gender and recording crimes based on gender identity. So as you said before, what we've had is biological men who have committed very violent crimes or sex crimes being recorded as women. And we've seen in the stats an uptick in the theory of violent crime from women. But of course, that's not what's happening. What's happening is we have men identifying as women and distorting the facts. This is really important and very serious. Can I just ask,
these men who say, I want to be identified as a woman, do we call them trans women, or simply men whose preferred gender identity is to be a woman? I mean, is there a distinction to be made here?
I think the complicated thing here is we're talking about data, and what Alice O'Sullivan has found is that there's huge amounts of confusion over the language. A lot of people don't know that trans woman means biological man that's transitioned to woman. They might think, it's a woman that's trans. A lot of people don't know what the difference in gender and sex is. I mean, gender doesn't really mean anything.
That's why I started. Yeah. I started with an explanation, because I think probably when I was much younger, a teenager, I maybe didn't know the difference between gender and sex. But what's relevant for crime and education and health service is biological sex.
Yes, I completely agree.
And sport, of course, sorry.
Yes, and sport, particularly women's sport. And I think the erosion of language in these areas has been part of a policy capture by Stonewall. So I prefer to use biological sex terms when discussing this, because we can't afford confusion in data. Confusion in the data, as is found in this report, has meant that people have missed cancer screenings. It means that we don't have the data required to police different groups. We don't know who is doing crimes. And it means there's been huge safeguarding failures. One of the most shocking parts of this report for me was that there's no minimum age at which a child can change their recorded gender in the NHS number. Which means that from a very, very young age, a child's medical providers could have completely incorrect information about their sex.
I was reading, I think, in Alice Sullivan's report that there was a case in the NHS where a GP was asked by a mother to change the biological sex of her baby, and the GP agreed, so the biological sex was reassigned to the other sex, and that this is how it goes. You can elect to have even your child identified by the different gender, even though the biological sex is the opposite.
This was one of the most shocking parts of the report for me, and particularly shocking was the fact that in this situation you're mentioning, the case wasn't recorded as a child protection issue at all, and social services weren't engaged, which really, really alarmed me.
And when it comes to the criminal justice system, we've seen cases of perpetrators who've identified as female or who declare themselves to be trans women placed in the women's prison estate. I think that is no longer the case. And of course, we've seen Donald Trump acting almost immediately. One of his first executive orders was that there were only two biological sexes, and if you had a passport, you had to be one or the other, and it had to be consistent with your natal sex. So in America, there has already been a vibe shift. Do you think this Sally Sullivan report means there could be a vibe shift here?
I hope so. We're working against decades of campaigning by activist organisations to erode the importance of biological sex and try and replace that with gender identity. And I think what's happened is those campaigners are clearly in the minority. The majority of people I speak to, all the polling shows the public care about biological sex. The public don't want to see men in women's prisons or women's sports. They don't want to see children transitioned in school. But every single organisation within the state has been infected with this problem. You've got the health service, the criminal justice service, the civil service, all pushing this ideology. Many of them were members of Stonewall schemes up until a few years ago. So I think while there's been a ideological vibe shift, and while the public is on board, there's now a lot of legislative work to do to get these problems out of the state, to issue guidance. Wes Streeting has come out and said that he's going to accept the Sullivan review and act on it, which is really good news. But that sort of hard work needs to be done across the entire government.
And are the gender ideologists, the activists, going to mount a pushback if Wes Streeting does adopt these recommendations when it comes to public institutions recording primarily biological sex, in addition, if necessary, to gender ID?
I imagine so. Wes Streeting has been very strong on protecting women's sex-based rights, and he made the puberty blockers ban indefinite a few months ago. But he has faced at every stage campaigning from activists not to do this. And he will have a sort of tough road ahead, continuing to make sure that gender ideology doesn't win.
It strikes me that, people listening to this will say Lara Brown's at the Policy Exchange, which is a conservative-leaning think tank, and I'm a certain age where that gender identity was not in the ether in the way that it is now. So it's a couple of TERFs just rubbing their hands at a document that seems to reinforce their own prejudices. Are we out of touch, Lara?
I don't think we are. I don't think this is a political issue. I think this is an issue that unifies most of the public. I think it's an issue that is directly in touch with reality. Sex is a clear physical thing. Every single cell in my body is female, and that can't be changed. This isn't a question of identity or opinion. I think it's a question of fact. It's a question that most people now agree on. And it's a question that unites most of the major parties. The Labour Party have continued many of the Conservative moves to remove gender ideology from the government. And just to give you some stats, this isn't a small thing. So Sullivan found that less than 20% of surveys held by the UK Data Service didn't ask for, less than 20% asked for sex. So over 80% of surveys asked for some variation of gender identity, gender, or a murky combination of sex and gender, which was conflated and not properly understood. We have lost thousands and thousands of pieces of data, and that's data the government needs to protect the public. This is important. It's data the NHS needs to make sure the right people get the right health service and the right health screenings. So I think this is not political. I think this is just a fact, like question of biological reality and fact.
I wonder if our listeners agree. Do you agree with me and Lara that public institutions and bodies should primarily collect data when it comes to biological sex and not gender identity? Lara Brown, thank you very, very much indeed for your time. She's a senior research fellow in equality and identity at the Policy Exchange, and I'll get back to your calls